The question I raised in the second installment is simple. Why does socialism appeal to some Christians? Many assume Christians would recoil from socialism given that its most radical expression, Marxist communism, led to the death of millions where they were implemented. Russia under Lenin and Stalin, China under Mao, and Cambodia under Pol Pot. On closer inspection, however, these Christians are not drawn to totalitarian socialism, but to the social programs and policies championed by democratic socialists such as Zoran Mandani and Nathan Robinson, who present themselves as heirs to the humane ideals of socialism, no violence. To understand this appeal, we must recall the working conditions that shaped Karl Marx's thought in early 19th century London. Marx's critique emerged from real suffering in the first industrial cities. Workers endured dangerous conditions, low wages, and high mortality rate. Reports from the time indicated that the average lifespan of the working class in Manchester was around 17 years. Can you believe that? More importantly, Marx saw wealth concentrated in the hands of a few property-owning capitalists and concluded that capitalism produced systematic injustice. His solution was revolutionary, the abolition of private property and hierarchy in pursuit of an egalitarian ideal, summarized in his dictum, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. That vision was explicitly secular and in practice hostile to organized religion. By the late 19th century, however, working conditions had improved and wages had risen. It showed that Marx was kind of wrong. Thus, the prominent Marxist Eduard Bernstein argued that social changes could be achieved through democratic institutions and legal reform rather than violent overthrow. This turn toward policy and reform, social democracy, helped produce modern welfare states like Scandinavian countries and a range of practical interventions aimed at reducing poverty and insecurity. The classical Marxists didn't like Bernstein. Instead, classical Marxists continued to deny the evidence and insist on an eventual revolution by the working class. Those who deny facts in order to preserve their agenda are, by definition, ideologues. I will return to that a little later. Now, going back to the original question, what attracts certain Christians to the moral appeal of socialism across time? It is not the godless utopia envisioned by Marx, Robinson, or William Morris, whose utopia excluded the church. No God. Rather, Christians are drawn to the policies and programs proposed by democratic socialists like Mandani that sound very, very biblical, helping the poor and the vulnerable. The Apostle Paul notes that Peter urged him to, quote, continue to remember the poor, end of quote, Galatians 2:10. And James writes that, quote, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is to look after orphans and the widows in their distress, end of quote, James 1:27. What then was Mandani's winning platform in New York? It included rent-free, fare-free transit, pay maternity leave, and municipal grocery initiative, presumably offering lower-cost food. So, who supported his successful candidacy? According to Baya Ungar Sargan, a UC Berkeley PhD and former deputy opinion editor at Newsweek, Mandani's base consisted of, quote, Muslims, South Asians, and a wave of 20 and 30-something overeducated, over-credentialed, downwardly mobile hipsters, end of quote. Now, considering this observation, I realized that one of the groups Ungar Sargan described closely resembled very young people I had met in churches within my organization. They are well-educated, well-credentialed Asian Americans in their 20s and 30s working as professionals whose parents originally came from East Asia. While they appear upwardly mobile, their strong support for BLM in recent years suggests that many believe oppressive forces beyond their control shape their lives, including their career trajectories. This sense of oppression among the privileged is not unique to our congregants. It reflects a broader cultural pattern. Wendy Kaminer, a former national board member of the ACLU, reflecting on campus activism, once asked, quote, why do some women on Ivy League campuses among the most privileged people on the globe feel oppressed? Why do more middle and upper class whites feel oppressed than lower income women and girls of color? End of quote. This psychological posture makes them especially receptive or vulnerable to narratives of structural injustice which democratic socialism foregrounds. And that is precisely what seems to have happened to many people who attend our churches, because practically all of them go or went to college. What is college like today? The environment where nearly all of them spend 4 formative years under the influence of their professors. Jonathan Haidt, co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind and professor of ethical leadership at New York University, notes that while professors have long leaned left, especially in the humanities and social sciences, a healthy intellectual environment requires a ratio of 2 or 3 liberals for every conservative. But in these disciplines tied to social justice concern, that balance has collapsed. By 2016, the ratio was over 10 to 1. The imbalance is even sharper in academic psychology. For every 1 right-leaning professor, 17 identify as left-leaning. As recently as the mid-90s, the ratio was 4 to 1. Wow. Such a radical change in such a short time. The result, Haidt warns, is that students in politically homogeneous departments are exposed almost exclusively to research from the left half of the spectrum and therefore tend to land to the left of the truth on average. In my mind, this skews young mind in 2 ways. First, it weakens the biblical understanding of the human nature as, quote, deceitful above all things and beyond cure, end of quote, Jeremiah 17:9. Since the social sciences treat people mainly as products of their environment. Second, the environment, framed as dominated by white supremacy, is seen as exploiting racial, gender, and sexual minorities under the rubric of intersectionality. Given this, Haidt's observation applied to young people in our theological conservative churches more than any other religious subgroups in the United States. I'm absolutely sure. This is one reason why, despite their pietistic faith, or perhaps because of it, they might be more receptive not only to socialist ideas and programs, but to progressive agendas as whole. This is not a criticism of their character, but an observation about the intellectual environments that shape them and their minds. This raises an important question. Should the church counterbalance these formative influences? Yes, but doing so effectively is tricky. In defense of pastors, they cannot preach about social justice, socialism, or climate change every Sunday. People come to church to hear the gospel and messages of faith, hope, and love. And even when pastors address politicized topics occasionally and with limited research time, it is unlikely to shift the center-left political instincts of their congregants. For example, when they hear the word justice, many think first of social justice rather than the justice of God satisfied in Christ. When they hear equality, they often imagine equality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity. When they hear poor, they assume more government subsidy is better. One area pastors should focus on is helping their young, intellectually engaged believers think less ideologically and more biblically. This mindset surfaces not only in academic setting, but also in public activism. Consider what rock musician Bob Geldof, who organized a Live Aid concert in 2005 to advocate for increased government aid to poor African nations, once said. When told that foreign aid had not helped, mostly due to internal corruption, Geldof famously replied, quote, "Something must be done even if it doesn't work," end of quote. What? Something must be done even though it doesn't work? That is precisely the problem. Acting on ideology rather than evidence leads to ineffective or harmful policies. Repeating, it is time for our spiritual leaders to help their well-educated, well-credentialed young people stop thinking ideologically and start thinking biblically. To continue supporting failed programs and policies despite the evidence simply because one prefers the idea is no different from the classical Marxists who denied the improving working conditions of Europe in the late 19th century in order to insist on revolution as the path to egalitarian utopia. Universities have spent decades producing ideologues who are open not only to socialist ideas but to progressive agendas more broadly. But if something doesn't work, we must look for approaches that actually help. Whether the label is capitalism or something else, the answer must be grounded in scripture. And as we will see, many biblical principles guide us toward effective ways of helping the poor and vulnerable, a concern Marx himself shared, though his proposed cure proved far worse than the disease he diagnosed. In the next video, we will examine whether social programs that reflect socialist ideals, equality or egalitarianism, such as taxing the rich, foreign aid, rent freezes, and affirmative action, which appeals to many young Christians, have truly helped the intended groups.